The human walked into training. The cubs jumped from the pack and ran to her. The gates of Verath Prime were made of black iron and old bone. They had stood for 300 years, and in that time they had opened for soldiers from 41 different species. Tall ones, scaled ones, ones with 4 arms, and ones with no eyes at all. The gates had seen everything. They had never opened for a human. But on a gray morning, when the training ground fog still sat low over the stone yard, the gates opened again, and through them walked Rena. She was not tall, she was not wide, she did not have scales or claws or a second set of shoulders. She had a worn military bag over one shoulder, a pair of scuffed boots on her feet, and a small cut on her chin from a shaving accident 2 days ago that had not quite healed. She walked in like she had been there before. Like the gate was just a door, and the other side of it was just another room. The yard was full. Hundreds of recruits stood in their groups, sorted by species, waiting for the morning briefing to begin. The Kreth soldiers stood in the far left corner. They were large. The smallest of them was nearly 9 feet tall, and their skin was the color of old rust. They had 4 thick arms each, and flat, wide faces with no visible nose. When they breathed, the air around them shook slightly. They had been the dominant military species in the coalition for 60 years. They knew it, and they carried themselves like they knew it. The Morokai stood near the center of the yard. They looked from a distance like large wolves that had decided to stand upright and wear armor. Their fur was dark gray and silver. Their ears were high and sharp, and their eyes caught light in a way that made them glow faintly, even in daylight. They did not move much. That was what the Morokai did. They watched, and they remembered. The Dravathi were near the back, long-limbed and pale, with wide black eyes and fingers that bent in 2 directions. They were quiet as a rule. Their homeworld had no loud animals. Everything on it communicated in low vibrations and color shifts. Noise, to them, was something enemies made. They stood close together and did not speak. There were others, too. Species that did not have easy names in any human language. Species with shells, or with extra joints in their legs, or with skin that changed shade depending on their mood. The yard was a collection of the Coalition's best young soldiers, all brought here to become something more. And then Rena walked in, and every single one of them stopped and looked at her. She did not stop and look back. She walked to the intake desk near the gate, picked up the form that was sitting there, and started filling it out. The clerk behind the desk, a small Dravathi with pale green skin, stared at her with wide black eyes, and did not speak for a full 10 seconds. "Human?" the clerk finally said. "That's right," Rena said, and kept writing. "We have not had a human here before." "I know," she said. "Where do I sign at the bottom?" The clerk pointed. Rena signed. She picked up her bag, asked where the sleeping quarters were, dropped her bag there, and came back out to the yard before the morning briefing had even started. She stood at the edge of the yard, near a stone wall, and looked out at the field. The fog was starting to lift. The training dummies at the far end were visible now, tall metal frames built for bodies much larger than hers. She looked at them for a moment, then looked at the ground, then looked up at the observation deck that sat above the yard on the eastern wall. Commander Dohan was standing on the observation deck. He had been standing there since before the gate opened, and he had watched all of it. He was a tall man by human standards, broad in the shoulders, with short dark hair going gray at the sides. He had fought in 4 coalition wars. He had trained soldiers from 19 different species. He had a long scar that ran from his left ear down to the corner of his jaw, and he had never once explained how he got it to anyone who asked. He had not asked for a human recruit. The assignment had come from Coalition High Command 3 weeks ago, with a short note that said simply, "Rena, human, combat designation, active. Report to Verath Prime." No background file, No physical assessment results, no list of prior training, just a name and a species and an order. Dohan had sent 2 requests for more information. Neither had been answered. He watched her now from the deck. She was standing alone near the stone wall, relaxed, arms loose at her sides. The Kreth soldiers were openly staring at her from across the yard. 2 of them had leaned over to say something to each other, and one of them made a sound that was the Kreth version of a laugh, a low, rolling rumble in the chest. Rena heard it. She turned her head slightly in their direction, then turned back to the field. Her face did not change. Dohan noted that. The briefing started at the first bell. All recruits were called to the center of the yard. A senior officer, a Kreth named Vorath, who had been running briefings at Verath Prime for 20 years, stood on a raised platform and spoke in Coalition Standard. He explained the rules. He explained the schedule. He explained what was expected, and what would happen to those who did not meet expectations. His voice was flat and heavy, and left no room for questions. When the briefing ended, the recruits were sorted into their training groups. Rena was placed in Group 7. Group 7 had 12 other members, 4 Kreth, 3 Morkai, 2 Drevathi, and 3 others from species that had no common name in Standard. When Rena walked over and stood with them, one of the Kreth soldiers looked down at her from his full height and said something in his own language. The others around him made the chest laugh sound again. Rena looked up at him. She was quiet for a moment. "Say it in Standard," she said. The Kreth soldier looked down at her for a second, then looked away. He did not say it in Standard. Rena nodded slowly, like she had learned something useful. Then she looked back at the training field and waited for the day to begin. She did not look angry. She did not look nervous. She looked like someone who had already decided something, a long time ago, and was simply waiting for the world to catch up. The fog finished lifting. The sun came up hard and white over the walls of Verath Prime. Somewhere on the other side of the training ground, the first drill bell rang. Rena picked up her bag and walked toward it. The human walked into training. The cubs jumped from the pack and ran to her. The gravity harness was not designed for humans. It was not designed to be cruel either, not exactly. It had been built for Coalition soldiers, and Coalition soldiers came in a wide range of sizes and body types. But the baseline setting, the one they strapped onto every new recruit on their first day, was calibrated for the average Coalition body. That meant it was calibrated for something much heavier, much denser, and much more structurally reinforced than a human being. When they put it on Rena, it sat wrong on her shoulders. The straps were too wide. The weight distribution across her back was designed for a spine that had more vertebrae than hers did. The harness added the equivalent of 2.5 times her own body weight, pressing down on her constantly, making every step feel like walking through wet concrete. She did not complain about the fit. She picked up the harness when her name was called, walked to the fitting station, let the quartermaster, a bored-looking Dravati who did not look up from his log, strap it to her, and then walked out onto the field. The field was a long stretch of flat stone ground with a dirt track running around the outside edge. In the middle were obstacle stations. There were walls to climb, bars to cross, weighted sleds to push, rope lines to crawl under, and a long section of uneven ground at the far end that shifted under your feet in unpredictable directions. Every recruit was expected to complete 2 full circuits of the field under the harness before the midday bell. The Kreth soldiers moved through the first circuit like it was nothing. Their 4 arms helped with the walls and the bars, and their bodies were built for weight. They moved heavily but steadily, and they did not slow down. The Morkai were faster. They were not as strong, but they were fluid. They moved low to the ground on the climbing walls, used their claws on the bars, and crossed the uneven section with the ease of creatures that had spent their whole evolutionary history moving over unstable terrain. They made the circuit look like something between a run, and a hunt. The Dravathi struggled with the walls, but were extraordinary on the rope sections. Their long fingers and the way their joints bent gave them a grip that nothing else in Group 7 could match. Rena fell on the third obstacle. It was the weighted sled, a flat metal platform loaded with stone blocks that you were supposed to push from one end of a 10-meter track to the other. For a Kreth soldier, it was a warm-up. For Rena, under the gravity harness, it was a different problem entirely. She put her hands on the bar, set her feet, and pushed. The sled moved about 1.5 feet. Then her boots slipped on the stone, and she went down on one knee. One of the Kreth soldiers across the field made the chest laugh sound. A few others picked it up. It was not quiet. Rena got up. She adjusted her footing. She pushed again. The sled moved another 2 feet. Her legs were shaking. She pushed again. Teho was watching from the edge of the field. He was young for a Kreth, which meant he was about 40 standard years, which was roughly equivalent to a human in their mid-20s. He had been assigned to Group 7 as the unit medic, which was a role the Kreth gave to soldiers who were not yet proven in direct combat, but who showed enough steadiness to be trusted around injured people. He carried a medical kit on a strap across 2 of his 4 shoulders, and a log tablet in one of his lower hands, and his job today was to record any injuries or medical stops. A medical stop was when a recruit signaled that they needed to pause due to physical distress. It was not a failure. It was built into the training program. High Command understood that first-day loads under the harness were extreme, and recruits were expected to take stops when they needed them. It was considered better than collapse. Teho had his tablet open. He had already logged 4 medical stops before midday. 2 Dravathi, one of the unnamed species recruits, and one of the younger Kreth, who had pushed too hard on the first circuit and cramped badly in his lower arms. He watched Rena push the sled. She got it to the end of the track on her 4th attempt. Her hands were shaking when she let go of the bar. She stood for a moment, breathing hard, then moved to the next obstacle. She fell twice more before midday. Once on the uneven ground section, where her left ankle turned under her and she went down hard on her side. Once on the climbing wall, near the top, where her grip gave out and she dropped. The harness made the drop worse than it should have been, pulling her down faster. She hit the mat at the bottom and lay there for 3 full seconds. The yard was not quiet at that point. Several soldiers from other groups had gathered along the edges to watch Group 7's first circuit, and when she fell from the wall, there was noise. Not all of it was laughing. Some of it was the sharp intake of breath that happens when something unexpected occurs. Some of it was silence. Teho's hand moved toward his tablet to log a medical stop. She stood up slowly, and it clearly cost her something. Her left side was going to bruise badly. Her hands were red from the bar, but she stood up, looked at the wall, looked at the mat, looked at the rest of the obstacle course stretching out ahead of her, and she walked to the next station. Teho did not log a medical stop. He stood there with his stylus above the tablet, and he did not write anything. He watched her walk away, and he felt something that he did not have a good word for in his own language. In Standard, the closest translation was probably something like uneasy respect, but that was not quite right either. By midday, when the bell rang and the first circuit officially ended, 5 out of 13 members of Group 7 had completed the full circuit. Rena was one of them. She was the only one who had fallen more than once. She was also the only one who had not stopped. Dohun saw it from the observation deck. He had watched the whole morning without moving from his spot. When the midday bell rang, he looked down at the field and counted. Then he looked at Rena, who was sitting on the ground near the stone wall, drinking water from a canteen. Her hair stuck to the side of her face, her left side already darkening with the beginning of a bruise. She was not looking at the other recruits. She was looking at the field. Specifically, she was looking at the uneven ground section at the far end, the one that had taken her down. She looked at it the way someone looks at a problem they are already working on solving. Do-hoon had been a soldier for 30 years. He had seen a lot of recruits on their first day. He had seen ones who were naturally talented, and ones who worked hard, and ones who had heart but no technique. He had seen first days that were brilliant and first days that were disasters. He had very rarely seen someone fall that many times and look by midday not defeated but simply busy. He made a note on his own tablet. It said nothing dramatic. It said, "Human, Day 1, watch." He put the tablet down and went to get his lunch. Below in the yard, Rena finished her water. She looked at the uneven ground section one more time. Then she lay back on the stone, stared up at the white sky, and let her body rest for the 20 minutes that the midday break allowed. When the second bell rang, she got up and walked back to the field. The human walked into training. The cubs jumped from the pack and ran to her. The third rotation began on a quieter morning. The fog came back overnight and settled thick and low over the yard, and it had not lifted by the time the first bell rang. The recruits came out of their quarters in the gray light and moved to the field in groups, their breath visible in the cold air. There was less noise than there had been on the first day. First days always had noise, new people figuring out where they stood, who was strong, who was not, who they needed to watch. By the third rotation, the sorting was mostly done. People had found their place in the order, and they moved to their stations with the quiet of a group that had already made its judgments. Most of those judgments, where Rena was concerned, had been made quickly. She had finished every drill in the first 2 rotations. She had not finished first in any of them. She had not come second, or third, or anywhere near the top. She had come in at the bottom of Group 7 consistently, the last to finish the circuits, the lowest numbers on the strength stations, the slowest times on the run track. The numbers were not good. On paper, a report of her first 2 rotations would have read as a struggling recruit who was failing to meet coalition baseline standards. The paper did not record the number of times she fell. It also did not record the number of times she got back up. The Kretz soldiers had moved past open laughing. They were not kind. That was not really in their nature, especially not towards someone they saw as weak. But the chest laughing had stopped somewhere in the second rotation, quietly, without anyone marking the moment it ended. One of them, a large Kreth recruit named Koru, had watched Rena complete the final obstacle of the second circuit the previous evening. She had finished it long after everyone else was done, in the low light of early evening, alone on the field. Koru had been walking back from the equipment shed and had stopped to watch. She had gone over the last wall slowly, arms shaking, and when she got to the top, she had sat there for a moment, just a moment, and then climbed down the other side and walked off the field without looking back. Koru had not said anything about it to anyone, but he had not laughed since. The Morokai noticed everything. That was simply what they did. They noticed the way Rena moved differently at the end of the day than at the beginning. Not worse, which was what most recruits did, but differently. Like she was adjusting. Like her body was learning something each time and feeding it back. Yuna, the pack mother who had accompanied the Morokai recruits as their unit elder, sat in her usual spot on the low stone bench at the edge of the yard, and watched with her pale eyes, and said nothing. She had been watching since day 1. She had not stopped watching. But on the third rotation, something happened that no one had planned for, and no one afterwards could fully explain. The cubs were there. Morokai culture had a tradition, older than the coalition, older than interstellar travel, of bringing the young ones to watch training. Not to train themselves. They were too small, too undeveloped, too far from the age of combat readiness. But the Morokai believed in a deep and practical way that the young needed to see what effort looked like. They needed to be near the people who were being forged into something. It was not about inspiration in any simple sense. It was about exposure, about letting the young ones develop their instincts around real things, real people, real fire. There were 6 cubs today. They ranged in size from about knee-height to waist-height on a Morkai adult, which put them at about shin to mid-chest on a human. They were dark-furred and quick-eyed, with ears that moved independently, tracking sounds around the yard. They had been brought by Yuna, and were sitting with her in their usual cluster near the stone bench, pressed together in the way young Morkai did when they were calm, shoulder to shoulder, small and watchful. They had been there on the first day too, and the second. They had sat with Yuna and watched. They had not moved from her side. Until now. Rena was in the middle of the field, working through a solo strength station. It was a pulling exercise, a thick rope attached to a weighted frame that had to be hauled hand over hand until the frame reached a marker on the ground. Most of the recruits had already completed it and moved on to the next station. Rena was still there. She was working slowly, both hands on the rope, leaning back with her weight to help the pull, and the frame was moving, but only just. She was not looking anywhere but the rope and the marker. The cubs stood up. It happened all at once, which was unusual. Usually when young Morkai moved, one moved first, and the others followed. That was the pack instinct. Follow the lead, follow the motion, wait for someone to set the direction. But this time, all 6 of them rose at the same moment. Yuna felt it before she saw it. She felt the shift in the group beside her, the sudden change in their stillness, and she looked down just as they began to move. They went across the yard fast. Not running exactly. Morkai cubs did not run straight. They moved in a kind of flowing, angled rush, quick and low to the ground. They crossed the open stone between the bench and the field in seconds, slipping between 2 recruits who were walking back from a station, cutting around the edge of the dirt track, heading straight for Rena. Yuna was on her feet immediately. Across the yard, other soldiers saw it. The movement of small, fast creatures crossing open ground triggered something in nearly every species present. An alertness, a sudden sharpening of attention. Hands moved, heads turned. 2 Kreth recruits stepped forward instinctively before stopping themselves, unsure what they were reacting to. Rena heard them coming. She had the rope in both hands, and she was mid-pull. But she heard the small claws on the stone, and she turned her head. She saw them, 6 small silver-gray shapes moving toward her at speed, ears flat, eyes bright. She let go of the rope. She turned to face them. And then she did something that later several different soldiers from several different species would describe separately and with varying degrees of surprise. She crouched down and opened her arms. Not wide, not dramatic. Just a small opening, a lowering of herself to their level, a quiet offering of space. Like she understood what they were. Like she had seen animals before and knew the difference between a charge and a run towards something. The cubs reached her and did not slow down. The first one ran straight into her arms. The second climbed onto her knee. 2 more pushed up against her sides. The 5th sat directly in front of her and looked up at her face with enormous amber eyes. The 6th went around behind her and pressed its small head against her back. Rena sat down fully on the ground. She had to. There was no other option. There were 6 of them, and they were insistent, the way young animals always are, with the complete and uncomplicated certainty that they were exactly where they were supposed to be. She put one hand on the back of the cub in her arms. Her other hand went to the one on her knee. She just sat there in the middle of the training field, with 6 Morkai cubs surrounding her, and looked up at the gray sky for a moment like she was figuring out what to do next. Across the yard, Yuna had not moved from the spot where she stopped. She was standing perfectly still, which was not something the pack mother did often. Her ears were up and her pale eyes were fixed on Rena and her cubs, and her expression was not something that translated easily into any non-Morokai term. The yard was almost completely quiet. Even the fog seemed to have stopped moving. The human walked into training. The cubs jumped from the pack and ran to her. It took about 3 minutes for the adults to respond. Those 3 minutes were strange. The yard, which was supposed to be in the middle of a training rotation, had essentially stopped. Recruits stood at their stations and did not move. Officers on the perimeter stood and watched. 2 drill instructors who had been on their way to the far end of the field had paused halfway across and were standing there with nowhere obvious to go. No one seemed to know what the correct action was, so no one took any. Rena sat on the ground in the middle of it all, with 6 Morokai cubs around her, and was, as far as anyone could tell, simply comfortable. She was not performing anything. She was not looking around to see who was watching. She had one hand moving slowly across the back of the cub in her arms, the same steady motion you would use if you were calming any young animal. And she was looking down at the one sitting directly in front of her, which was looking back up at her with enormous amber eyes and making a low, continuous sound in its chest. Not a growl, something softer. Something that, if you translated it into purely functional terms, meant approximately, "I am exactly where I should be." It was Junho who moved first. He was Yuna's eldest, a scout in his early prime years, fast and lean, with darker fur than most of the Morokai recruits. He had been at the far end of the field when the cubs ran, and he had crossed the yard at speed and came to a stop about 4 meters from Rena. He did not come closer. He stood and looked at his pack mother's cubs, then looked at the human, then looked back at the cubs. His ears were moving constantly. His tail was low and still. After a moment, he turned and went back to Yuna. She had not moved. She was still standing where she had stopped, perfectly upright, both hands folded in front of her, in the formal posture she used when she was thinking deeply about something. Junho came to her side and spoke low in their own language, a quick series of short sounds and soft consonants that the translator tags most recruits were only caught partially. Yuna did not answer immediately. She kept watching Rena and the cubs. Then she walked forward. She crossed the yard slowly, with the deliberate pace of someone who is not rushing because they do not need to. The recruits near the path she was taking stepped back slightly, not out of fear exactly, but out of the instinctive awareness that Yuna was a creature that commanded space. She was taller than most of the recruits, even the Kreth, and she moved with the absolute ease of something that had never in its life had reason to doubt its own body. She stopped a meter from Rena and looked down. Rena looked up. She did not stand. Standing would have disturbed the cubs, and she seemed to know that. She stayed seated and looked up at Yuna with a calm, open expression. She was slightly out of breath from the training. Her hair was still stuck to the side of her face from the morning drills. There was a fading bruise on her left arm from 2 days ago. She looked, in almost every physical sense, like the least impressive creature in the yard. Yuna looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked at her cubs, at the way they were settled, at the sounds they were making, at the particular way the one in Rena's arms had its head tucked under her chin. She looked at all of this carefully, and her expression shifted into something that was not easily readable to non-Morokai, but which Junho, watching from behind her, recognized immediately. It was the look she got when something confirmed what she had already suspected. Commander Dohun came down from the observation deck. He did not run. Dohun did not run unless the situation required it, and this did not require it. But he came down quickly and crossed the yard with the straight-line efficiency of a man who had been thinking about this moment since it started. He reached Yuna's side and stood there, looking at Rena and the cubs, and then looked at Yuna. Explanation, he said. He always spoke in short sentences when he was processing something. It was a habit from long years of needing to communicate clearly under pressure. She waited until the cub that had been watching Rena's face turned around, looked at Yuna, and then turned back to Rena again, like it had checked in and decided to stay. "You know what the cubs are for," Yuna said. Her standard was precise and careful. She had learned it later in life than most, and she spoke it the way someone speaks a language they respect but did not grow up with. "You know why we bring them to watch training." "To develop instinct," Do-hun said. "To be near real soldiers." "Near real fire," Yuna corrected. She looked at Rena. "The cubs do not choose where to go based on what they see. They cannot assess strength. They cannot read combat records or skill ratings. They are too young for any of that. They choose based on what they feel. It is an old instinct. It goes back a long way, before we had words or armor or anything we would now call civilization. The young ones go to the fire that will not go out." Do-hun was quiet. "They have sat beside me at every training session for 3 rotations," Yuna continued. "They watched every recruit on this field. They did not move, not once, not for any of them." She paused. "Until today." Do-hun looked at Rena. She was gently moving the cub off her knee now, making room, slowly, so she did not startle it. The cub moved, settled against her side instead, and stayed. She glanced up at Do-hun and Yuna, and there was a brief moment where she seemed to consider whether she should stand. She decided against it. Junho had come forward now and was standing just behind Yuna. He was the one who gave the fuller explanation, because Yuna rarely elaborated once she had said the essential thing. "The instinct reads something specific," Junho said. "His standard was better than his mother's, fast and natural, with the slight clipped quality that Morikai's speech always had. Not strength, not skill, not aggression. It reads something that does not translate into one word well. The closest thing in standard would be persistence. But that is not quite right either. It is more like," he paused, his ears turning slightly as he searched for it, "the part of the creature that does not know how to stop. The fire that does not recognize the concept of going out." The yard was still quiet. Most of the recruits had given up pretending to be at their stations. Do-hun looked at Rena for a long moment. She was not listening to the conversation, or if she was, she gave no sign of it. She was looking at the cub in front of her again, the one with the amber eyes, which had now put one small paw on her knee and was making the soft chest sound again. Do-hun had 30 years of reading soldiers behind him. He had gotten good at seeing things quickly, what a person was made of, what they would do when things got hard, what would remain when everything easy was gone. He had looked at Rena on the first day and written "watch" in his tablet because he had seen something. He had not named it then because he was careful with names for things. He preferred to let evidence accumulate. He thought about the first day, the falls, the deading up, the way she had looked at the uneven ground section at midday, not defeated, not resentful, but simply working. He thought about the second rotation, the long evening on the field alone, finishing the circuit in the low light when everyone else was already at dinner. He thought about the fact that Taeho had not logged a single medical stop beside her name. He looked at the cubs, which had not moved from their chosen spots around a human sitting on the ground in the middle of a training field. He looked at Yuna. "She is staying in Group 7, he said. Yuna's ears moved forward slightly. It was the Morikai version of a nod. Do-hun turned and walked back toward the observation deck. On his way, he stopped beside Taeho, who was standing near the edge of the field with his tablet and his medical kit, and an expression that was hard to interpret in Kreth facial terms, but that contained somewhere in it something very close to awe. "Not one medical stop," Do-hun said. "No," Taeho said. "3 rotations, yes." Do-hun looked at him. Keep logging. Then he walked up the steps to the deck, and stood at the railing, and looked out over the yard. Below him, Rena finally got to her feet. The cubs moved with her, several of them standing, 2 staying pressed against her legs. She looked down at them, and then she looked at the rope station, the one she had left when they arrived. She walked back to it. She picked up the rope. The cubs sat in a loose cluster at the edge of the station and watched her work. The human walked into training. The cubs jumped from the pack and ran to her. Word moved through Verith Prime the way it always did, not through official channels, not through reports or briefings, but through people. Through one soldier telling another in the corridor between quarters, through a medic mentioning something to a drill instructor over evening food, through a Morkai scout stopping to speak quietly to a Drevathi officer near the equipment shed, and the Drevathi officer repeating it to someone else the next morning. By the 4th rotation, everyone at Verith Prime knew about the cubs. Not everyone understood it. The Kreth as a species did not have a strong relationship with instinct reading in their young. Kreth cubs were assessed for combat suitability through physical testing, not anything softer. Several of the Kreth recruits thought the whole thing was being made too much of. An animal went where it went. Koru, the large Kreth who had stopped laughing after watching Rena finish her circuit alone in the evening, did not say this out loud, but he also did not agree with the ones who did say it. He stayed quiet and watched the field. The Drevathi understood more. Their species had old knowledge of instinct reading in other creatures. On their quiet homeworld, learning to read what animals did and did not approach had been a survival skill long before space travel. One of the Drevathi recruits, a slim one named Ara, who almost never spoke in group settings, told the 2 recruits nearest to her that where a young pack animal chose to go was never meaningless. That it was, in fact, often more accurate than any formal assessment. That young creatures did not have the social learning yet that told them to be impressed by size or rank or reputation. They only responded to what was actually there. Ara said this once, quietly, and then did not repeat it. She did not need to. Bora arrived on the 5th day. She came from Coalition High Command, a senior analyst, small and precise, with close-cut gray hair and a tablet she carried everywhere, and the particular manner of someone who had spent 30 years turning observations into numbers and numbers into conclusions. She was officially at Verith Prime for a routine assessment of the training program. She had a schedule that included meetings with Delhun and a review of the facility's performance records. She spent most of her time on the observation deck. She watched Group 7's 4th rotation from start to finish without speaking. She had her tablet, and she made notes, but not many. Mostly she watched. She watched the Kreth recruits move through the circuits with their steady, heavy efficiency. She watched the Morkai flow through the obstacles. She watched the Drevathi find their grip on the rope sections. And she watched Rena work through each station in her consistent, unhurried, relentlessly incomplete way. Not finishing first, not finishing near the top, but finishing. She also watched the other recruits. By the 4th rotation, something had changed in Group 7 that was not in any official record and could not be found in any performance log. It was a change in atmosphere, which was harder to measure than times or weights or completion rates. The Kreth recruits were no longer watching Rena with the sideways attention of soldiers watching someone they expect to fail. They were watching her with something that had no good single word, a combination of study and discomfort and reluctant recalibration, the particular feeling of having decided something about someone and then finding, repeatedly, that the decision was wrong. Koru on the 4th rotation finished his own circuit and then came back and stood near the rope station while Rena completed hers. He did not help. He did not say anything. He just stood there. When she finished and let go of the rope, he gave a single short nod, a Kreth gesture that carried approximately the same weight as a slow, deliberate handshake, and walked away. Rena looked at his back for a second, then looked at the next station. The Morkai recruits had already shifted. They had shifted on the day of the Cubs, quietly and completely, the way the Morkai did things. They had not discussed it among themselves, at least not within earshot of anyone who could understand them. But in the way they occupied space near Rena in the yard, not close, not crowding, but present in a specific way, the way a pack is present around something it has acknowledged, it was clear that something had moved. Even the Dravathi, who did not typically show anything in their faces or their posture, had changed in small ways. Ara, who had explained instinct reading to her neighbors, now ran her morning circuits on the track at the same time as Rena. She was much faster and finished well ahead of her each time. But she was there, each morning, and she started when Rena started. Bora spent 2 hours on the observation deck, and then went to find Dohun. He was in his office, a small stone room on the ground floor of the command building, bare except for a desk and 2 chairs and a shelf of records. He was writing reports when she came in. He did not look particularly surprised to see her, which meant he had probably known she was on the deck. She sat down without being invited and put her tablet on the desk. "Your morale metrics," she said, "are unusual." "Yes," he said. "Across all units, not just Group 7. She turned the tablet so he could see the numbers. "Overall performance scores are up 3% from this point in the last cycle. Completion rates on the final daily circuits are higher than any equivalent rotation in the last 4 years. She tapped the tablet. "That does not happen from training program changes alone. The program has not changed." "No," he said. "Something else changed." Dohun put his pen down and sat back. He looked at the tablet, then at Bora. "A recruit came in on day 1, he said. She came in last, in every measurable way. She fell more than anyone else. She finished last in every circuit. She has not broken a single record." He paused. "She has also not stopped once, not for 3 full rotations, not for 1 drill." Bora was looking at him steadily. "Recruits here are from 30 different species," Dohun continued. "They came in with their own hierarchies, their own ideas about strength, their own definitions of what a good soldier looks like. Those definitions did not include her. She did not fit any of them. And then she kept going, and kept going, and she kept going after that." He picked up his pen again. "You cannot watch that for 3 rotations and not have it do something to you, regardless of what species you are." Bora looked at her tablet for a moment. Then she looked up. "I'll need to include this in the report," she said. "I assumed," he said. She stood. At the door she stopped. "The Morokai cubs," she said. "I heard about that." "Yes. Do you think the instinct is real? That they actually read something?" Dohun considered this for a moment. He was a careful man with careful opinions. "I think," he said, "that the cubs went to the only creature in that yard who would not, under any circumstances, let them down." He picked up his pen. "Whether that is instinct or just very good judgment, I am not sure it matters." Bora left. On the field below the command building, the 4th rotation was finishing up. The last recruits were coming off the obstacle course as the evening bell rang. Most of Group 7 had already cleared the field. The Kreth were at the equipment shed. The Morkai were moving in their quiet cluster toward the rest area. The Dravathi were already gone. Rena was still on the field. She was at the uneven ground section, the one that had taken her down on the first day. She was not doing it as part of a drill. The rotation was over. She was doing it on her own time, in the low amber light of evening, moving across the shifting ground slowly and deliberately, finding the rhythm of it, learning the way it moved under her feet. She went across it once, turned around, and went back the other way. She did not know she was being watched. She did not know about Bora's report, or the morale metrics, or the conversations in corridors. She did not know that Koru had told 2 of his fellow Kreth recruits, quietly, that he thought she was going to finish the full program, and that neither of them had argued. She did not know that Ara ran her morning circuits at the same time on purpose. She did not know that Tejo had begun writing small additional notes in his medical log beside her name. Not medical observations, just notes. Things he had seen, things he did not want to forget. She crossed the uneven ground for the third time. Her footing was better than it had been. She could feel where the surface was going to shift now, a half-second before it happened. Her body was learning it. Everything she did went somewhere, into her muscles, into her balance, into the quiet, accumulating record of a person who had decided that falling was just a part of the process, and the process had no endpoint. The evening light went flat and gray. The yard was empty and still. Rena crossed the uneven ground one more time. Then she stopped, stood up straight, and looked out across the quiet field. At the obstacles, at the walls, at the rope stations, and the weighted sleds, and the long dirt track running around the outside. She looked at all of it the way she had looked at it on the very first morning, when the fog was thick, and the gates had just opened, and 600 soldiers from 40 species had turned to stare at her. Like it was just a room. Like she had always planned to be here. Like she had no intention, then or now, or at any point in the future, of going anywhere else. She walked off the field. The yard was quiet behind her. Above it the first stars were coming out over Verath Prime, cold and very far away, and the training ground sat empty and still in the dark, full of the particular silence that belongs to places where something real has already begun. They did not fear her strength. They feared her refusal to have none.